culture. Okay, that's great. And so you just wanted to sort of get a little bit more, some more meat, some other perspectives. That's great. How long have you been teaching? Let me just do a quick, just to get a show of hands, or not a show of hands, I'll just go around. Emily, how long have you been teaching?
I am in my 9th, going on my 10th year.
Okay. And you teach French?
French, yes. And
French.
so I try to teach as much about French-speaking Africa as I can. Just I don't want my class to be, all white. I want it
Yeah,
to, have some richness to it and include all areas of the French-speaking world.
that's great. That's great. It's super interesting. I have a little bit of insight in the French system because I serve as the inspecteur délégué for the international option for the baccalaureate. And so I serve for the French Ministry of Education. And it's really interesting because, so I grew up in part, my mother is from Peru, my father's from India, but my father took overseas positions and we lived in North Africa for a number of years. So I grew up speaking French just because it's a French former colony. And what's really interesting is like, even today, and people will say this, and I'm sure you've heard this before, which is that the history of colonization and slavery is seen as, oh, well, those other colonial powers did it. We were sort of exceptional. And it's really incredible, even today in the French school system, that sort of general posture is sort of there, despite the extraordinary role of sort of France in the transatlantic slave trade and, in all the anti-colonial struggles. You'd think there'd be more, but it's always really a struggle with the French Ministry of Education. So this stuff is really ingrained. So we're fighting really deeply seated sort of biases. So that's the French. But in America, most people just don't know what Africa is. They just sort of think of it as sort of this country, right? And so we have to try to really educate our young people and older people about the diversity and richness. So I went off on a tangent. Marie, how long have you been teaching?
I'm in my 11th year. And I am heard about this because I'm part of the African Studies program at Boston University. I'm getting my Teaching Africa teaching certificate, as well as my master's in art education at the same time.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, and I'm actually teaching my 5th grade students about kente cloths right now. And so I'm trying to connect the history and contemporary artists and what's happening now in Ghana contemporary, because we just spoke about the African diaspora. So we are now, I'm trying to bring it all together.
That's wonderful. That's great. And what about Mary? Mary Bashir? Hi. Where are you based and how long have you been teaching?
I think this is a code question for how old are you? So I'm kind of onto this, but that's all right. I'll say I've been teaching for 20 years. And yeah, I'm in the Boston area and it's great. And I am always trying to learn as much as I can and be aware of my positionality as I teach these things and just really deeply try to learn more.
That's wonderful.
With my students, and not say like, oh, I'm teaching you this, because I'm clearly not the authority. And I humbly really want to learn. So
that's a great posture, because I think students pick up on that and they are more open to ask, quote, dumb questions or just ask questions, so that's great. And I actually don't even know. It's funny, Mary, you should say like it's code for this. I don't even know why I said how many years. I just came up with it.
That's
But actually, as you said that, I realized like it's really a testament to those who have been teaching for a while to do something like this, because it says that you're open, you're interested in continuing to learn. So kudos. I went back to school recently to study biology. So I'm at Guilford College. I'm a student. I literally got my student ID. I'll show you, literally. I'm so proud of it. See, it says student over there. And I think it's important that we keep open, that we all remain students of whatever field of study. I just happen to be interested in biology as well. But So Shelby's driving, so I'm not going to. We'll skip you unless you want to, unless you can talk. But you're.
I can go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, I've been teaching for about 14 years, and just to echo Mary, I wanted to do this. My students, I teach in Asheville, and they have a very limited grasp of the globe. And I actually had a student this year that thought that Africa was its own country. Like they had no idea. And so I'm just so appreciative for this and the information and the knowledge that you're giving us. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, I think going back to, I think what Mary had said about, you know, not being the authority. I think that it's interesting because in departments, you'll have sometimes, you know, not necessarily at the flagship institutions at the top tier, you'll have just larger departments, but sometimes you'll just have like one Africanist versus like 7 US historians or, you know, 4 European. So Africa is treated as sort of like this thing. And so I think that we all end up being sort of knowledgeable, maybe a deeper dive in one area, but then you have a handle on a lot. So in some ways, it's really true with such large spaces like Africa that we are all sort of always learning. So that's really important to put out there. So others can chime in, but if you're off camera, I don't want to impose on you, but you can also share through the chat. Let me just make sure that I'm keeping up with that. Okay, good. I wanted to deepen my own content knowledge. This is great. Okay, so I think a couple of people have mentioned sort of this about geography, and I think that's where we really have to start. So I think Americans in general don't learn geography that well. And we have to constantly we have to be almost intentional to learn about new places. And the ways in which I think most Americans learn about new places is when we have like some terrible thing, like we're going to war, or we're doing something, and all of a sudden people are like, okay, where is Iraq? Where is, or some catastrophe, and they learn about it for the first time. So I think as a general thing, I'll just start off with a pedagogical point, if you will, which is that I think that we should always be incorporating geography, like always, because the reason why it's twofold. On the one hand, people don't know that much. I mean, adults and students, but it's very graspable. You look at a map, there's a country there, you name the country, and you're like, oh, I now know where, Niger is. So there's a feeling of like, oh, okay, I can do this, right? And I know, like, as a student coming back, that if I can understand, I get a grasp on something, it feels good, and I'm like, oh, then I can keep learning, right? So you want to kind of reinforce that positivity. So geography is really helpful because you learn geography, but also it's motivating to people. And so you might want to be doing that throughout your teaching, whatever the subject, bring out a map and just do that. You can always go to that. It's a very simple thing to do. The other thing I'll mention, again, I feel like I'm doing this backwards. I'm talking about the content first. But the other thing I just want to mention, I think it's as a historian, you're trained to kind of look at, quote, primary sources. I do think it's really important to look at primary sources, whatever field of study you're coming in, because some people are coming in maybe from a more language perspective, somewhat from geography perspective, et cetera. I think that getting primary sources, and here's a trick, reading them aloud together is the key. And many of you probably do this, if not all of you, but I think that activity of literally being not on the same page, but you know what I mean. And the way that I do is I have people read, depending on how long a piece is, either a full paragraph or just like read 2 sentences, and then we'll go to the next person and have it be like in line. And then on Zoom, it's a little bit more tricky. But you can do it alpha, you can just call people out. But I think there's something about that gets people on the same page, and then you can go back and discuss. I'm always one for less is more. I think that you can take 1 paragraph of reading and really deconstruct with it. I know there's some pressures, there's different kind of pressures depending on where you are to kind of get through curriculum, to move. And there is something to that, you get a sense of the totality, but I think deeper learning requires going a little bit slower and just questioning. Being philosophical, which means questioning the underlying assumptions about whatever it is that we're looking at. And so I think that that's a very important thing to do. So let's talk about Ghana. Stacy, thank you again for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I thank you all again for coming, especially at the end of such a long day for you. You all get up early. I got up especially early today, so I'm with you on that count. And it's the end of, at least for the university, it's the end of the semester for you. You have a bit more to go. But so thank you, just as a fellow teacher, I really appreciate you taking the time for the benefit of your students ultimately. So let me talk about Ghana from a sort of a storytelling perspective, which is my own sort of connection with Ghana. I don't want this to be about me, but I think there's some relevance here, which is that I started off at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I didn't know what I wanted to major in. I had no idea. I think I was a business major because I didn't know what you were supposed to do when you go to college. So it's like, okay, I'll be a business major. So I did that. And then I met, I took an anthropology course, and the TA was from Peru, and it just clicked. And I'm like, oh my God, you can study about cultures around the world? That's amazing. I happen to have grown up in different parts of the world just because of my father's job. So in North Africa and the Middle East, my mother's from Latin America. So we spent time with family there, family in India. So we bounced around a lot. And, but one of the things that was lacking throughout my education was the centrality of Africa in world history. And the person who ended up sort of bringing that to my attention was a Ghanaian anthropologist named Maxwell Owusu, who Stacy mentioned in my little bio intro. And he was actually the advisor of this TA. Her name is Charo Montoya. And Maxwell Owusu, I ended up taking a course with him, and I was just like, this is so cool. I had no idea about some of this history. And I ended up working as a research assistant for him. I was part of this minority program called the Summer Research Opportunity Program. It was a Lillian Mellon Foundation thing for first generation students of color, underrepresented in PhD programs. And so they threw some money at me. I had no idea what I was doing. Somebody had actually told me, why don't you fill this out? This might be good for you. And I'm like, oh, okay. I was super lucky to have people who looked out for me in that way. And so we ended up doing work together. And in my second year, I ended up deciding to leave to go to London. That's where he had gone, to the London School of Economics. And he thought I would do better there because I was sort of more like a free thinker. I didn't like to be micromanaged and as a, in class with quizzes and stuff. And so I just wanted to do my own thing. He said, I think you might be good in this system because they just give you these big exams at the end of the year. So you just kind of do your own thing, go to class or not. And so I was on my way there, and Maxwell invited me to do research with him. So I ended up in West Africa. But one of the first lessons that he had given me was to understand, and he didn't use this language, but he talked about basically how you have to understand Africa as central to world history. And he had me watch, some documentaries. I think one was a Bob Marley documentary, and I was transcribing some stuff and just doing some, copying stuff for him. And I was like the worst copy person because I would do it really fast, and it'd be sort of like not really well done. And he was like, I don't think I'll be asking you to do this in the future. So I got myself out of that. But I had this tremendous opportunity to go to West Africa and do field work with him. And so what he did was he was on the committee of experts on the Constitution of Ghana. This was in 1990. And Ghana, going back to 1957, was the first nation to gain its independence in sub-Saharan Africa. It wasn't a bloody civil war, but there had been a lot of bloodshed in Ghana because of it being a central supply point for the transatlantic slave trade. And so there had been a number of forts, major forts there, Elmina and others, that were constructed along the coast of West Africa. And the Portuguese were there, the Dutch, the English more recently. And by 1957, this movement was able to get rid of the colonial rule. And Kwame Nkrumah was the great hero of the day at that time. But the country, since 1957, and it really served as a tremendous source of inspiration for other African nations about the decolonization process, and was this a signal sort of to the larger African diaspora. It's a real point of pride. It remains so. And the star, the star, a lot of the flags in African countries, that red, green, yellow, black combination, comes from a flag that Marcus Garvey had created many years before. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican Black nationalist who talked about going back to Africa, and both metaphorically, but also trying to get people back to Africa. And so this was a star, and his idea was sort of manifested. I mean, Garvey wasn't around at the time, but it was manifested in Ghana gaining its independence. And Ghana was part of a number of countries that were trying to lead this Pan-Africanist movement to try to join forces. And so it was tremendously hopeful, a tremendous source of pride for Black people all over the world. Ghana gained its independence. And 1957 was followed by a number of other nations gaining their independence. In fact, in 1960 alone, 16 nations in Africa gained their independence. So this is a very important period of time as part of the decolonization process. It was not bloody in terms of a civil war, unlike what had happened, say, in Algeria. In Algeria, over 1 million people died in that fight for independence. And when I was a child, we lived in Algeria when I was in the 1970s, there was still a lot of tension there. And I remember one of my earliest memories as a child was seeing French kids that were still there and that I went to school with the local Algerians getting into these fights. And I remember this one distinct time when I was hiding behind this like column because they were throwing stones at each other. It was really scary as a kid, but I remember holding that memory and thinking, why are they so angry, you know? And there was just a lot of like tensions and hatred there. And in fact, one of my earliest heroes, his name was Cheta, was the school bus driver. And he had this like hole, like not a hole, but like a scar. And he said, and I don't see why he would make it up, that it was actually a bullet that went and just sort of grazed his neck. And so he was one of the revolutionaries in that war of independence. And he was just one of those people who was always very happy and grateful. And I think it's partly because he survived the war and, you know, and lived. But so Ghana inspired many people across the world. And, but since that time, it went back and forth between sort of these military control government, civilian control government, and it went back and forth. And the most recent military government from 1981 to 1992 allowed for elections in 1992. And that was the government of the Provisional National Defense, which was led by Jerry Rawlings. Actually, J.J. Rawlings is not a name that's not well known in the United States, but he's one of those really important African leaders. And he led a coup as an army officer, and basically led the country through a process that would ultimately lead to civilian control. And he recently passed away. Actually, part of my inspiration for deciding to talk to Stacey about doing this talk was actually because JJ had passed away, and I was like, you know what, I want to bring some of that history back so that people know about JJ Rawlings. He wasn't loved by everybody, but he was beloved by many people. And in 1990, the government was going through this transition, saying, okay, how do we blend Western constitutional forms of government with our indigenous traditional forms of government? And so Maxwell Owusu, being Ghanaian, he was trained actually at the London School of Economics and Political Science, then University of Chicago, and did a postdoc at Harvard. And he was sort of just ideally positioned as an anthropologist to talk about, you know, how to incorporate some of these local traditions. And one of his great contributions was really to push, at that time, he was doing his doctorate in the late 60s, mid 60s, was to push the government, to push the field of anthropology to become, in some ways, to be mindful around the stuff that Mary was mentioning. Just, I keep talking about Mary, about interest, about being in, what was the word that you said? Positionality, right? And this is not something that anthropologists were being trained to understand, just their own positionality. They were sort of being trained to just come in and sort of observe and do ethnographic work, and, you know, as if that wouldn't really change anything. But we know that one of the hallmarks of anthropology is participant observation, that being an observer changes what's happening. And part of the problem with anthropology has been traditionally that it's many people that are coming in to observe and join the communities to learn about them don't speak the languages. And that's a real problem. They learn there to a certain extent, as much as you can learn within a year or what have you. But Owusu was saying, you know, when you're in West Africa, in Ghana, you need to be able to command multiple languages to understand what's going on. It's only Americans for the most part that end up speaking mostly one language, English. I mean, there's more Latinx people who speak, you know, Spanish and English, but most Americans don't speak more than one language or two. In much of the world, people speak multiple languages. It's very commonplace for people to speak, you know, 3 languages, and kids pick it up. I certainly did. I don't think of myself as a good language person. I just grew up speaking French because it was being in that environment, and then Spanish at home. And I didn't learn Urdu that well, my father's language. But in any case, his critique was that you need to have people who are knowledgeable about the languages and are connected. And so he served on this committee. And what the committee was trying to do, again, was to make recommendations on the new constitution as part of the elections for 1992 that would blend traditional forms of government. And what he said was the following. Let me just pull it up real quick. He said, African democracy may require the integration of indigenous methods of village cooperation with innovative forms of government, combining the power of universal rights with the uniqueness of each district's or nation's own customs and respected traditions. Now, Owusu was idealistic in some respects because he thought that you could reconcile these, quote, universal principles with local indigenous traditions. But what happens when some of the local indigenous traditions are, like in most of the world and in practice in the United States, sexist, if not misogynistic, and you know, what do you do with that? But he believed that there was enough overlap and there was ways that you can incorporate local traditions, the best of local traditions with the best of Western constitutionalism, and the Constitution tried to do that. And so what they try to do is create a decentralized, well, the solution as he saw was to create a decentralized state where you would have local authorities, primarily chiefs, right? Chiefs, by the way, never went away. Chiefs have always been part of African traditions, despite colonial intrusion and sort of the breaking up of those traditional practices. They still remain part of the mix. And it's not just chiefs that command political authority in West Africa and in Ghana in particular, but there's also the role of market women. And I don't want to overstate it because still it's a male-dominated society, but market women play a tremendous role when it comes to adjudication. For instance, in the local market, when people have disputes, they don't go to the local court. It's just like too lengthy a time, and you have to pay people, and it can be a mess, as is the case in most of the world, right? So people look to the market women, women who are usually a little bit older, who have some seniority, and they adjudicate differences. So basically what Owusu was saying was that people should, what was a viable solution was to look to these chiefs, which relies on a sort of a decentralization of power towards what you may call headmen. And they're headmen, and there's also these lineage heads who can participate directly in the state processes and decision making. And it wasn't uniform across the country because, as many of you know, within Ghana alone, there's about 7 or 8 different linguistic and groups, you know, from the Akans to the Ewe to the Ga to Basare to the Fante. There's a number of groups. But there are chiefs throughout Ghana. And so the advantage of having these local leaders better identify the needs of people's priorities, of the villagers, would make them more accountable to the members of the community, and would in some ways serve as the go-between to the state. So it really was trying to get the people engaged politically through the traditional systems, but connecting it to the larger state. And so that was the task. I think that the experiment is ongoing. I think in some places it's worked. I haven't been in Ghana in over like 15 years. It's been a while. I went with a group of teachers actually about 2008. So it's been a while. It's been actually a long while. But I think that Ghana is emblematic or symbolic of the pride of Africans seeking their independence against colonial regimes. What we know about Ghana is it's tremendously diverse, not as diverse, say, as Ethiopia, where there are about 80 distinct languages. Sub-Saharan Africa, actually all of Africa, there's, depending on the linguist that you're talking to or the anthropologist, but somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 distinct languages spoken in Africa. So tremendous diversity there. So Ghana has tremendous diversity. Again, not as much as maybe say, Ethiopia, but it's also the case that the linguistic diversity comes with also cultural diversity. So I named a number of tribes or nations within the nation, but each of them have their own traditions and practices. And so when we talk about Africa, we always have to remember just how tremendously diverse it is. We know at the genetic level, we are most diverse in Africa. We all come out of Africa. We are all the descendants of some 70 or so people that made it out among one of the migration processes out. And when we talk, somebody mentioned the African diaspora. I think it was Marie who mentioned the African diaspora. One thing I always want to raise is that the African diaspora isn't just Africans leaving Africa. It's actually also the internal migration. People, famously, as many of you know, there was this Bantu migration from the area of Nigeria, that part that sort of traveled across, and we can trace it through language analysis. Linguists have traced sort of the migration of people across all the way to the Swahili coast. So many of the languages that are spoken, well, specifically Swahili in the East African coast, are Bantu in their structure, although many of the words are borrowed from other languages. So there's migration within and then outside of Africa. And so again, just to go back, Ghana, tremendously diverse. It's emblematic of sort of the larger country and the struggles for independence and post-independence struggles to really have an economy and politics that is of benefit to its own people. So those are sort of, I think, some ways of framing sort of thinking about Ghana and social justice issues politically. I'm happy to sort of just have a conversation. I didn't want to talk too much and drone on and on and on. So I thought maybe I could just stop here and then we can just have a conversation about some things that you might think is interesting or questions that you might have that might be helpful for your own teaching purposes. So let me stop there. Open floor, open whatever. What questions, what thoughts do you have? I'll have some coffee. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mary, go ahead, please.
This isn't like a deep, question, but you just mentioned Bantu, and last week the speaker was talking about apartheid in South Africa, and she was talking about the Education Act, and she said, "Oh, it used to be called the Bantu Education Act, but that is inappropriate. Now we call it this other act." So then that word like triggered that memory for me. So what are the connotations around that? What does that word represent? Or is that two different contexts?
Yeah, it depends on who you're talking to. So the Bantu migration is something that most people think about as it's a more of an academic kind of term. I think regular people don't think of Bantu so much, but I think it had, like anything Africa that's being described by non-Africans, it carries sort of hints of primitivism, backwardness, and all that. So I don't know the specifics of what our colleague was saying in this conversation about changing the name, but it could be some of that. And so they maybe have wanted a name that was a little bit more affirming. The Bantu migration was basically a migration of people based on new technologies and being able to kind of hoe with new types of steel tools that could really advanced agriculture, and they sort of just cut a swath and sort of migrated down and then over across basically all of the southern part of Africa, along East Africa's coast as well. So that's what comes to mind. I always say that when you say tribe, and you talk about Africa, it's impossible to escape the kind of racism that is laden in these terms, because tribes mean something different, say in like South Asia, when you talk about the Pashtun and the others, or even the tribes in Europe. But tribe in Africa has all these racist connotations as well. So people have tried to appropriate that language because that's how people think about it in many parts of Africa. My tribe, my group, my people. But words, depending on who's saying it and the context, can have pejorative terms. So I'm saying this not to have people walk on eggshells. I don't think that that's helpful, to be like, oh, am I saying the right term? I'm saying the wrong term. But I think it's about your sort of the posture you take around these things and saying, well, in some cases, it may be seen as not a great descriptor, and that it has a colonial sort of history that positions Africans as less than white Europeans, for instance. And there's a whole, racial hierarchy. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi, as great as he was also just racist. I mean, he was racist towards Black people. So like, it's complicated, right? So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think of language all the time. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Other thoughts? Yeah, Marie.
So I know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Constitution was adopted in 1992, and since then it's been fairly peaceful. And I know the Akan, and I know this just from my research for the Kente cloth, because that's what we're talking about. The Akan tribe, I know they take up a majority of the population.
Yeah.
So how is the relationships between all these different ethnic groups in Ghana, and how has it been able to keep such a peaceful, I mean, not saying that I'm sure there's issues throughout, but compared to countries that are even close around them?
Yeah. That's a good question. So the Akan make up not quite 50%. So they're the largest sort of ethnic group, tribal group, ethnic group. Then, you have the Ewe, who they're less, they're significantly less. It's something like 15%. And you have the Mole Dagbon, who are also, and the Ga. And then the other percentages are much smaller. There's like, 5% of this, 5% of that. So the Akan are really the dominant. It's kind of like in Ethiopia, when you think about like the Oromo or the, like they're like one of the big ones. So one of the things that's interesting is that I think, and this is true in many places where you have many different ethnic groups, tribes, the dominant ones tend to dominate the political culture, right? And in a multi-party parliamentary system, they tend to dominate mostly. What's really, and I was thinking about this, the Kente cloth, because I teach in the Black Studies program here. It's called the African American and African Diaspora Studies program. And actually I have an appointment also in the geography department and in environmental something. I just keep adding. I'm like, ooh, I'll affiliate to this one. And because my work is really interdisciplinary, and it's fun to meet new colleagues from other places. But then my courses are cross-listed, like between many areas. One of the things I think about because I always participate in the graduation ceremonies for our ADS students, is that they wear the Kente, right? And it's a source of tremendous pride for our Black students. And, we also get white graduates actually every once in a while, but mostly Black students who graduate from the program. The irony is that, these were the people who also were enslaving others. But in some ways, I'm not the one to say, by the way, because that's not the spirit of why people wear it. They wear it because of sort of the resurgence of a kind of Black nationalism and pride in the 1960s specifically, but it dates to earlier than that. But the kente wearing was really going back to that period of time, and sort of the importance of Afrocentricity as a counter narrative to the colonial white dominant narrative. And so, I mean, I was inspired by that. I mean, part of why I became a historian because of Afrocentrist, literature. I was like, wait, why did I learn this? It's really important to have other perspectives that decenter things outside of Europe. Now, what we don't want to do with any kind of nationalism or centrism is to then flip it around and say that all things great absolutely come out of Africa. I could make the case that most things great come out of Africa because that's the fount of much of world civilization and greatness. But a lot of terrible things come out of Africa too, as is the case everywhere. So we don't want to glorify, and then that's always my sort of my critique is like we take the best of sort of the nationalist spirit and the pride of being of African descent, but we also don't want to be overly determined because when we start looking at the analysis, there's a lot of bad things that go on in the world, including in Africa. So this is a big spiel that I'm getting on the whole kente cloth, which is that we have to disassociate sort of the actual history of the slave trading Akan peoples who were engaged with white colonial powers, as was everybody else. They weren't the only ones. Slavery was not about our modern understanding of slave kidnapping, all that. I mean, it was just captives of war. And so people were fighting off, and it wasn't like, oh, you're my brother. No, you are my captive. I'm going to enslave you, or I'm going to sell you off to have more stuff. So one of the great ironies about African history and Africa as a term is that people become African by virtue of leaving Africa. That is, like if I was to ask you, let me ask Emily, or I can ask Karan Patel. How do you say your first name?
Karan.
Karan. So if I say Karan, if you and I traveled, we decided we're going to make a trip to China. Let's go to China, Karan. Well, let's do it. Let's go. I've never been to China. I would love to. I've been to Hong Kong, but never to China. Let's go to. And then somebody on the street said, "Oh, Mr. Patel, where are you from?" What would you say?
I think I'm gonna say the current country that I live in. Originally from India, but like because I live in for like 6 years, I'll just say that I'm from United States.
Okay, so you say you're from the United States. Okay, then you and I are flying back. We go to New York. Okay, we're in JFK. The flight is delayed, so we're there and we're like just trying to make the time go by. So we go to like the local airport, like burger or whatever place to sit down and eat. And somebody at the table says, "Oh, I was listening into your conversation. You were talking about such interesting things in terms of African history. Where are you from?" What would you say then?
I think I would still say America because like I haven't been to Africa, so like I would just say that I study about it, but never been to it.
Let me clarify. This is somebody who comes from Oklahoma. Okay, this is somebody from Oklahoma. He says howdy. I don't know if Oklahomans actually say howdy, but we'll just say that Oklahomans say howdy. He says, "Howdy, Mr. Patel. Where do you come from?"
I don't know what to say. I think I'll say India, but like originally from, my answer wouldn't change. Like
it wouldn't change.
Yeah, it wouldn't change for me at least.
Okay, maybe Karan, maybe you're not the best example because you're from India, who could be in the United States. Let me say, okay, let me put it this way. What part of India are you from? Where'd you grow up in India?
Gujarat.
Gujarat. Okay, my father's from Pune. So if you went to Calcutta, where would you say you're from?
Gujarat.
Okay. Now, if you're in Gujarat, and I'm not sure where in Gujarat you're from. Let's say I don't know what would be a good place. What is one of the border cities to another state?
Surat.
Okay, Surat. Oh yeah, I have family in Surat actually. All right, so if you're in Surat, okay, you're in Surat, and we're just like having tea, and somebody comes and says, "Oh, Mr. Patel, where are you from? What would you say?
Just Gujarat.
You would say Gujarat?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I might be missing a point, like what you're trying to say, but.
So where exactly in Gujarat were you from?
Ahmedabad, like
okay.
it's 1 hour like away from Ahmedabad.
Okay, all right. My point, which was not really well done here, friends, was that if you're in China and somebody asks you a question, most of you say United States if you're from the United States. If you get to New York and you're not from New York and they ask you, where are you from? You say, oh, I'm from Oklahoma. And if you're in Oklahoma at the airport, say, hey, where are you from? You say, oh, I'm from, Tulsa. And you're in your Tulsa, you say, where are you from? You say, oh, I'm from the east side of town. The point is that depending on where you are, you'll say usually something that's a little bit more understandable to that person. So Africans become African by virtue of leaving Africa because people didn't think of themselves as African. They thought of themselves as Akan or Ewe or Ga or Fante. They didn't think of themselves as Africans. And so it's by virtue of leaving that people begin to think of themselves as something other than Akan or Ewe, whatever, but as African. So I think that in teaching these stuff, we always have to remind ourselves that these are constructions, and they're relative to who you're talking to in the context. Sorry about that. I did not do a very good job there. Forgive me, colleagues. Other questions or comments you might have? Oh, there's some stuff in the chat. Should I be reading this? Oh, I start all my units where the artist movement piece is of art. Yes, nice. Yeah, art history is such a great way to get in there with students. It's so visible and yeah, tangible. It's great. Yeah, go ahead, Marie.
So another question I have, because I'm researching Afrofuturism Marcus Garvey is a huge part of that because of his Starship voyage that he wanted to take take everyone back, and he actually got people to sign up and it never came to fruition. And then Sun Ra, and I feel as though with the kente cloth that has become part of Afrofuturism because the whole point is to bring the present, past, and the future together.
Yeah.
And I have read some literature about the fact that some people in Ghana, various ethnic groups, became part of the slave trade because of the situation, and taking back the kente cloth, even though they were wearing it, is a way to take back their identity of where it originally came from.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just trying to understand the process that the Ghanaians have gone through to take back and become more peaceful despite their past.
Yeah, I don't think there was sort of full out sort of ethnic sort of warfare as there was in other parts of Central Africa and in other parts of what's going on, let's say in East Africa right now. So I'm not sure. In some ways, I think it's been a relatively stable two-party system there. It's gone back and forth. It's basically a two-party system. Is what's is the system. Basically, the National Democratic Congress, the NDC, and then the New Patriot Party, I believe it's called NPP. So those are the two major parties, as is the case in many parliamentary systems. Then, in the United States, we have the Democratic Republican Party, but oftentimes a conservative liberal. So it's been relatively stable in that respect. So the ethnic rivalries have been sort of controlled, if you will, put at bay because of that. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, if you actually, from the perspective, and maybe some of you know this, but from the perspective like West Africans, when African Americans come back to Ghana, a lot of African Americans go back because it's a source of distant family pride. There's a kind of a collective recollection, even if you don't know as a Black person in America where and Africa you're from, there's a connection there. So people go back and they kind of want to be embraced as brothers, but Africans don't see it that way. They just have a very different perspective on who Americans are, and or African Americans in particular. And so that's an ongoing thing. So in the same way that I think sometimes we clump together, even among the Akan, this is the point I'm making here, is even among the Akan, there are rivalries, there are tensions. So it's not like a united front among the Akan or the Ewe. I mean, the Ewe of Upper Volta, like people who are further up by Burkina Faso, are just different than those who come from the southern part of Ghana. It's not like they're totally distant, but there's differences. They sometimes kind of feel more connected to the Ga or whatever in their areas, or they feel more connected. Somebody was mentioning this, to people who are neighboring countries. So like people who are Ewe in Ghana might feel more closely connected to people in Togo who are Ewe than they do to people in Ghana itself. So there, that speaks to sort of the solidarity across ethnic lines, but ethnicity doesn't necessarily mean cohesion all across the board. For Marie is saying, Emily, I'm trying to catch up here with the chat. All right, so I am a UNC student here. Oh, okay, great. I want to deepen my own content knowledge. Is year 13 for me. Yep, I do the challenges with my students. Sorry, I think I'm like way behind here. We just labeled a map with where the clothing was made. It helps visualize. Oh, that's great. I start all my units of where the artist movement piece is. Yes, okay, that's great. Ewe also weave their kente cloths differently. There we go. That's an interesting point as well. Yeah, and the weaving is also, yep, and more. An example, like there's actually, so Accra is the main city. I mean, there's Kumasi further into the north, but Accra is where most business is done because it's on the coast. And but near the University of Legon, which is about half an hour out of Accra, up a ways, there's a town called Medina. Medina has sort of an Islam sort of connotation because Medina from the Hijaz in Western Arabia, but it's not just, there are Muslims who live there, but Medina is very multi-ethnic. So while you definitely have areas where you have larger groups of, say, Akan, the Kumasi area, et cetera, a lot of places people have their communities within the city. So it's not like a city is completely dominated by one group of people. So so that's, this is to say, I guess it depends. If you were Ga trying to make it in Kumasi, you would have a harder time because there you have a lot more Akan control, for instance, But I don't think it's as much a case. And also my experience that people don't move around so much within Ghana, at least in the contemporary period, from what I know. In earlier times, there might have been a little bit more motion, but not so much that I'm aware of. People tend to go to the big city. That's what they tend to do. Yeah. Other things that may have come up for you? I know it's late. It's 7:52 right now. We have a few minutes left. Maybe others who haven't had a chance to weigh in. I don't know if this conversation is actually helpful. It's sort of hard to take in information at this time of the day and everything like that. But I'll just go over a couple of the key points, which I think is use geography, use a map. I think that's really helpful to teach. It gives people a sense of confidence, and I think it's good to teach more geography. Diversity, always you have to stress that. Cannot understate the tremendous diversity in any parts of Africa, and of course Africa as a whole, and just sort of the longevity of African history, and that the history, right now I'm actually working with a classical philologist on a book project, because we taught this course a couple of times, called Africans in the Greco-Roman World, and it's sort of looking at the role of Africans in the Mediterranean world. So we're working on a documentary source book, and we're going to teach it the course again in the fall. And I couldn't teach this unless I was teaching it with a classical philologist. But there are these fascinating stories that go back to the ancient world of these figures, and I increasingly teach history through biography. So if I was going to teach contemporary history of Africa, would talk about J.J. Rawlings, for instance, of course, in Kwame Nkrumah, and then connect it with the African-American traditions and say like somebody like Du Bois, who actually makes his way over to Ghana and dies in Ghana at the end of his life. He's there. And then, of course, there's Marcus Garvey. But there are tremendously important women as well. In the ancient world, there was a figure named Kandakia Manorenas, this one-eyed warrior queen. If you're interested, I'm more than happy to email you. But there's some really cool women, African women leaders. She was actually a contemporary of Cleopatra, but she basically fought off the Romans in Kush in the area of Nubia. And there's both documentary evidence from Strabo, the geographer, but also physical evidence. I'll tell you one thing that she did, which is so cool. She actually raided the Romans who were trying to go further into Egypt at that time. This is now around 40 BCE, and she had one of the busts of Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, grabbed, and she takes his head, right, the head of the bust, and she takes it and she buries it at the base of her temple, so that anybody who's walking into her temple is essentially walking on his head. I mean, that is like so, isn't that like, I mean, I don't even know how to describe that. Like that, it's very creative as a way of disrespecting, your enemy. So there's some really cool figures in the past. So biographies, I think, are really helpful because it's hard to, yes, it's epic. It's hard to wrap your head around the Bantu migration, which happens over the course of 1,000 years. It's hard to wrap your head around even like the Akan. So speak to specific people if you can, and bring out those histories. And then I think primary sources, read together an excerpt. I think that's really helpful. Less is more. Is another thing. And I think the last thing I would say is timeline. Give your students some sense of basic timeline. Like, it doesn't have to be, depending on the period that you're teaching, but just something like, these are sort of like footholds for people to grasp onto. So those are just some principles that I think about in teaching, not only African history, but other areas of world history as well. Yeah. We have a couple minutes left. Is there any final thought or question that you might have? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think that it would be amazing if
Mary,
you have a chance to share the names of some of these women, and I could mail it out to everybody.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Because that's something I know I sure didn't hear about in school,
I'm going to put in the thing so that you have it. Kandake Amani Renas. Okay. You all have heard of Queen Nzinga. Does that name ring a bell? Oh, Queen Nzinga. Mm-hmm. She was this amazing woman from the area of Angola who basically negotiated power between the Portuguese that were trying to invade from this side and their African powers. And she basically maintained sort of control through diplomacy, but also through warfare. And she was just this tremendous figure. And so Queen Nzinga, there's also figures. I mean, I'm happy to put it together because I know that we only have a couple of minutes left. But those two figures, I'll just start with those two, and then we can add to the list. But biographies are good. I'll mention one person. He's a man, but I'm the biographer of somebody named Malik Ambar. He was from Ethiopia, and he basically was. He was Oromo from Ethiopia and was in the 16th century is enslaved, taken to Baghdad, and then goes to India and then becomes the de facto ruler in India. So you have this fascinating African diaspora in India. I did this exhibit with the New York Public Library at the Schomburg Center, which is online. I can also send the link to that on the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world. So we have to think not just Atlantic world, we have to think, and not just the Mediterranean like Kandake, but we have to also know there's this East Indian, this Indian Ocean world presence there and these leaders. So I'll send a list of a few people that might be interesting and helpful when you're trying to teach the totality. Yeah. Stacey, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that was exactly what I was going to ask about.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm happy about it. Well, thank you all for the time. I appreciate your coming and your attention and your questions. And it's a pleasure to be teaching some of this history alongside you. So thank you very much.